In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
If the landlord can hijack the rent by 20%, that impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
So hello everybody, welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head. I'm Max Golding. We've got Harriet Fraud. Got
Hi.
a great show. Always got a great show. So today we're going to talk about the triumph of Joe Biden. Everybody's favorite person on planet Earth. Everybody loves Joe Biden. So we wanted to have a discussion today about what Biden's presidency means for mental health. And if you've been listening to our show for a while, you know that we don't think about mental health as something that's just in your head. It's not just something that therapists help you with. It's not something that just drugs help you with. Mental health is kind of a holistic issue. So like housing and mental health are connected. Whether or not you are part of a union or a worker co-op at your job affects your mental health. Whether or not you have access to reliable transportation to get to your job or your loved ones, that's all mental health. So we're going to look at it holistically and see what we come up with. And we also, anybody that has thoughts on this issue based off of just whatever's already in your head on the topic or based on what we have to say, email us, let us know. This will be an ongoing discussion as time goes on. So Harriet, just maybe just as a immediate reaction to the election, I mean, what's your reaction generally and in relation to this question of what a Biden presidency might or might not mean for mental health?
Well, I am very relieved that we've gone from fascism to neoliberalism. That doesn't mean that there's a no holds barred jubilation here, because if he returns to what we had during Obama, which really engendered the rage on the part of so many people as income was shifted up instead of down, then after Biden may come another Trump. And so, therefore, I'm apprehensive, but at the same time, relieved. I would much rather have neoliberalism than fascism. However, it's not a no holds barred joy fest for me.
I feel pretty similarly. I feel like a mix of relief and hope and disappointment kind of all at the same time. I think I feel like and at the same time, we haven't really talked about this extensively, but I've been thinking for a long time about how like I kind of understand where Trump supporters are coming from sometimes in a weird way. Not that I think like Trump's policies or his affect or anything are great, but I think that a lot of the support for Trump over the years it isn't just these like rabid, like brainworm racists or whatever that people say. Like that's a part of the base for Trump, but a lot of them are, I think, like disaffected. There's a lot of working class folks from deindustrialized parts of America. Like when you look at just the split, like the hair split, just barely-ness of Biden winning, a lot of those people, there's some just schadenfreude against, I think, Biden and liberals in general, that they're just like, we hate liberals, we hate Biden, we hate these demonic Democrats or whatever. But I guess I kind of feel for them too, because a lot of us on the left are saying, okay, Biden's not going to be good enough, but we're relieved Trump is gone. But there's actually millions of Americans that are also counter to our perspective. They're terrified of what's going to happen now too, which is kind of an interesting, flip perspective, right? That they're now going to be in this like hyper vigilant, maybe like a hysteria, thinking Biden's going to take away my guns and I don't know, whatever else.
Whatever other propaganda that Trump spewed. I think also, aside from the gun love, is really a kind of love of a penis extender. These are men who have been deprived of their lofty position that they had as providers for dependent women and children. Now they can no longer do that. A man is no longer the king of his castle. The majority of divorces are initiated by women, and so are the refusals to be married in the first place. Marriage has become more of a luxury good that these guys can't afford. And
Right.
therefore, they're very angry and feel unmanned. And if you care about that vision of manhood as the boss, within that vision, they are. There's a hope, of course, that I have, and I know you share, Max, that people will be people rather than men and women. They'll be
Mm.
humans together rather than gendered in polar ways. But also, I feel for Trump's minions, some of them, because they are surrounded, as we all are, by the Wall Street swamp. And
Mm.
I think Trump speaks to their reality of rage, where they just want to bust up the government.
Mm.
And he does say, you've been duped, you've been tricked, it's fake news. And a lot of the news is fake. And they have
Mm.
been tricked. They've believed in an American dream which is not available to them anymore because they have
Mm.
inferior education and few supports, and none of the supports that their European counterparts have. They don't have guaranteed paid vacations. We don't have any. They don't have
Mm.
maternity and paternity leave. They
Mm.
don't have any. They don't have job security. They don't have powerful unions. And they
Mm.
feel dispossessed. And Trump captured the rage at being dispossessed, even though he made it worse for them all on every front.
Right.
It's an emotional thing that he did for them. And people's emotional survival, their sense that there's somebody and there's hope,
Mm.
is stronger than their physical survival because, they're breathing in putrid air, they're drinking contaminated water, they're eating food full of pesticides, they don't have the supports they need in their families. But he is telling them there's somebody, in fact, they're great.
Mm.
And they're going to be great again. In other words, they're going to be male dominant 1950s again, which of course is fake.
Well, and also because there aren't the same government subsidies for all that used to exist, and
Right.
so it's like a weird kind of scam. I wanted to shift real well. This is it's on topic and it segues a little bit, but there's I was reading Ben Burgis's article on Jacobin called "No Honeymoon for Joe Biden," and he kind of breaks down in the beginning some of the essentially like promises or platform items on the Biden Harris website that actually sound really progressive, and they sound like kind of ways that maybe some of these larger scale societal problems could get solved, and they actually sound kind of like almost like Bernie type of things. And for us to maybe dig into this a little bit, um, so the website, I don't know if it says it now, but it had said during the campaign trail that Biden wants to make community colleges tuition free, wants to create a public option to compete with private health insurance
Mm.
companies, and to allow workers to unionize through a simple and easy card check process, which is basically just it's a way easier way to unionize your workplace than the current method, which is just arduous and kind of an uphill battle. So if he were able to make that happen for workers, that would just insanely boost labor's membership and power. So those are just three options that Ben Burgis kind of picks out to say, I think, to try to give Biden the benefit of the doubt a little bit, to say like, well, hey, he's actually running on some pretty progressive policy. Not every policy sounds super progressive, but those are some relatively progressive um, ideas. And he goes on to say what I'd probably argue, and you'd probably argue, Harriet, which is that we actually don't have much of a reason to trust him, to trust that he's going to get any of
Mm.
that done. And like, even if, let's say, the runoff between Ossoff and I forgot the other person's name, but let's say the Democrats do end up taking the Senate, we saw from when, you had a blue, president, Senate, House, like all the way up and down the government during Obama's years, that virtually nothing got done.
Right.
I mean, virtually nothing progressive that I think, like Bernie came out and he was just like, here's the progressive platform. And, the left came out and said, oh, finally, something that makes sense. But
Mm-hmm.
Obama got basically none of that done. So, I mean, do we have any reason to think that Biden unilaterally, as this not even hugely charismatic leader, but as the guy that's not Trump, that he will make any progress for us in terms of better access to college, better health care, basically decriminalizing labor. Essentially,
Right.
is he going to do any of these things? Is he going to try? Is he going to pretend? I mean, what do you think?
Well, his history indicates that he has no separate interest in that.
Hmm.
Has been elected from a state whose basic industry is tax breaks for corporations. That's what attracts them and gives them prosperity. Plus, he has voted misogynistically against Anita Hill and in a racist fashion for incarceration, which is another way of creating slavery for Black people. And yet, he isn't Donald Trump. He's not a fascist. Were he pushed to the left by a well organized left, by a socialist party, then he couldn't do what Democrats always do, which is they suggest to people that they will do wonderful things like maternity, paternity leaves, community colleges,
Hmm.
ending student debt. And then when they get in office, they do the same kind of thing, not as radically as the Republicans. They also are much better on social things. There are fewer racial biases, so
Hmm.
that if you were rich enough or at the very top 1% and could be recognized, you would get a break and be able to go to a decent school. However, the class structure remains the same, and the mass of Americans remain immiserated. And that's true, Black or white. Black people got a lot poorer under Obama because he
Hmm.
decided to bail out the banks and corporations rather than the homeowners who had been sold subprime mortgages, so who
Hmm.
were overwhelmingly minority. So that it really depends on a movement from below. I don't think
Hmm.
Biden would have people shot in the street for protesting or
Hmm.
doing other left organizing, and that's a great progress from
Hmm.
Trump. But I think that without those organizations, those promises are hollow and will never be fulfilled. They're already trying to blame not expanding their hold on Congress and not expanding their Senate role fast and far enough. They're blaming it on the progressives. 38% of their vote was Black people, not rich Black people, but Black people who are suffering and who are poor. And they want to turn around and blame things like defund the police or Medicare
Hmm.
for all for their losses. No, Bernie would have won because he would have won Trump's voters. And the reason he didn't is that Lloyd Blankfein and the others at the top in Goldman Sachs and Morgan Chase said, if you do that, you won't get the money. You can't have two corporate parties that both represent the employer class.
Hmm.
Somebody has to represent the employees. And the Democrats pretend to do that when they want to get elected. And some people do that. AOC
Hmm.
does that. The squad expanded, it doubled. There are now
Hmm.
four other people. There's
Hmm.
Mondaire Jones, there's Richie Torres, there's Corey Bush, and there's Jamal Bowman.
Hmm.
And so three out of those four are men,
Hmm.
Black or Latino men. And these are progressive people. Richie Torres has been amazing in New York City, and so has Jamal Bowman. And they're also represented by the Democratic Socialists of America. And it's really time, I think, that if there's a real possibility of a left socialist party, Biden will have to move. But other than that, he'll do what they've all done from Clinton on, promise the world and deliver a depression in the standard of living. So that's what I think.
Here's a few snaps, some wiggly fingers. I agree with
Yeah,
all that. I think that the key thing I'm kind of hearing from you is the need for a push from the bottom, essentially. And what's funny is I mean Bernie had said this all along too, that he wouldn't be able to unilaterally achieve much of anything.
right.
I mean, there's executive orders that presidents can sign, but I mean, I think most like actually democratically minded presidents probably don't want to actually sign executive orders to begin with. Like somebody like Bernie wouldn't have actually wanted to just, okay, let's get Medicare for all through an executive order. I don't even know if it's
Right.
possible. But also just the way that the electoral map is set up, from gerrymandering to the electoral college to all the weird labyrinthine, probably overtly bizarre systems in which our so-called democracy works, is that you can't just get some new policy pushed through because you ran on it on a campaign. It gets people excited, like even something like Medicare for all or tuition-free college, or you name it, universal health care, I don't know, like massive funding for public housing. You do need like a really strong popular base to actually, whether it's get out in the streets and say we demand the thing, or incessant calling to representatives. There was another article by Jackman by Liza Featherstone, and the title of it was "There was actually a lot of good news for the left on election day," and you touched on some of that, like the squad kind of doubling in size. There also were a lot of really interesting things that happened, like so even though Florida voted for Trump, they passed a resolution to increase the minimum wage by $15 an hour, and I think it was around 60% of the vote. So I mean, there were a ton of probably Republicans that actually voted for that, or maybe conservative people, or maybe people that just didn't really, they were maybe non-voters, or sort of politically apathetic or burnt out or something, that turned out in massive numbers to get a $15 minimum wage for Florida. And there were a lot of things like that. There was like marijuana legalization. Arizona passed a statewide tax hike to bring $1 billion in new funding to the school system. There were actually a ton of progressive kind of down ballot initiatives and smaller scale elections that, I think DSA won the endorsed candidates that they were pushing. I think they won like 70 to 80% of the people they were pushing for. So
Yeah,
there's some really good signs. Those are signs
there
of good
sure
things to come,
are.
I think.
And these are signs of people organizing. One of the things that blew me away was what happened in Portland, Maine. They had referendum questions, 6 of them. 5 of them passed. And some of them that passed was minimum wage. And in times of COVID, when work is dangerous, $22 an hour, time and a half. It passed in Portland, Maine. They
Nice. Yeah.
banned facial surveillance by law enforcement. They implemented a Green New Deal for Portland. They capped rent increases to the rate of inflation and no more. They allowed marijuana businesses to expand. They lost one progressive thing because it was misadvertised, which was a tax on short-term rentals, because it was presented as poor Black people renting a room in their house and they ought to be allowed to. It was clever on the part of Airbnb and VRBO. Right. However, 5 out of the 6 won, and they won because of organizing in Portland, Maine by DSA and People First Portland, who had been working on these things and going door to door, like the squad, which is now 8 people, went door to door. And that's their people's politicians. They want to talk to them. They don't want to wait for 3.5 or 3 3/4 years and then put out some TV ads sponsored by rich people. Yeah. So there were very hopeful signs. And also, I think we do have to respect that it's hopeful that Biden won in spite of the gerrymandering that the Republicans managed to achieve, in spite of kicking a lot of people off the voter rolls, in spite of putting polling places far away from poor and poor Black neighborhoods, and in spite of all the shenanigans they've pulled, so that Biden's vote is more impressive, even though it was close, because it overcame all the roadblocks. The Republicans don't try to recruit voters anymore. They try to block people they don't want to vote instead. And they've been working very hard at that. Right. So, and a lot can be done. Those are very impressive things in Portland, Maine, even though Maine voted for Trump. They voted,
Right.
they pushed these things, they worked on these things, they organized around these things, they talked to people, and they won a
Mm-hmm.
wildly progressive
Mm-hmm.
status. They're the
Mm-hmm.
only place where during COVID workers are guaranteed $22 an hour. It's
Mm-hmm.
amazing.
Yeah, it's really impressive. And so to bring it back to the mental health question, because I feel like sometimes I can imagine being a listener if you're just jumping on board with our program and saying like, wait a second, why are these mental
Yeah,
health professionals talking about all this? Like, that's not mental health. So maybe just to clarify a little bit our position right
yeah,
now. So I'll kind of clarify mine. You can clarify yours. They're probably
good.
more or less the same. Is that the reason I think Carrie and I are really excited about these things? Because none of this is actually mental health policy. Like zero of what we just talked about is mental health policy, right? Mental health policy would be stuff like more funding for like, I don't know, mental hospitals or
Mental
community mental
health
health
clinics,
centers or mental
right.
health clinics, opioid, methadone clinics, more staff for suicide hotlines or domestic violence shelter beds, or I don't know. You can, there's, all that stuff. We could get more expansive on that if you want, and better trainings for mental health workers. I don't know. Um, I think the reason I'm not focused on that, I don't want to say I don't care about it. I do care about it very much. Um, but is that if you think about mental health holistically, like so for example, think rent control for a minute. Um, Without rent control, if you have like zero regulation on what a big kind of commercial real estate industrial model can do to human beings, if you think there's a regular working class neighborhood and a bunch of big landlords decide we're just going to hike the rents by like 50% or something because we really need to get these profit margins up. The guys up top, the shareholders, are saying we need to pull more profits. Okay, we need to figure out a way to kick people the hell out of their homes, and just we don't care where the hell they'll go, they'll figure it out. We need to get people with more money to start renting these units. So we're going to put notices on their doors. We're going to have these large construction machines outside doing quote unquote renovations, just going to make their lives hell until they leave. And then, or maybe we'll actually just figure out ways to physically remove them from the buildings. If you actually think about the mental health experience of a family or just some individual or a couple living in one of these units, and I've been one of these people, it is like PTSD induced, like actual kind of PTSD inducing. Um, Finding that you don't, especially if you live in an urban area where it's hard to find another place to live. Um, so in absence of rent control, landlords actually can do that kind of thing, especially the kind of the big commercial real estate industry thing. So that's just housing. That's just talking about housing as one issue. That's very much a mental health issue, right? So you get rent, and there's huge debates on rent control. Not everybody, I think like most mainstream economists actually oppose rent control, but the point is, if you actually put that in place, it gives a sense of security. It's almost like an anti-anxiety intervention
Mhm.
for renters that suddenly can say, okay, we know for a fact that based on this new law, this landlord cannot hike the rents by next year.
Right.
That means we can do maybe a little bit of financial planning. Like we know that we're not going to have to put more aside for some huge rent thing. You got a single mom saying like, thank God I can stay here at least another 1 to 2 years. So I can, because the rent's decent here, right? And it's it's somewhat close to my job. So just talking about say rent control on a as a state ballot initiative or so like a municipal law or something like that. Like to me, that's cut and dry. That is a mental health issue. Like to me, um, and you can kind of go down the line from like minimum wage, right? So in Florida, again, Florida as a state voted for Trump, but roughly 60% of voters voted yes for the uh, $15 minimum wage, right? So Fight for 15 campaign, which has been hugely labor led. I think SEIU has been kind of leading that for a long time.
Mhm.
It's finally becoming mainstream. The kind of corporate Dem people in Florida were they weren't pushing that. They weren't running on it. They lost. But now that's going to be the minimum wage in Florida. It'll probably be incremental. It probably won't be overnight. But again, workers that are getting like, I don't know, 10, 11, $12 an hour or less. I
Or
don't even know what the
7.
minimum wage is. Yeah, or
Yeah.
7 or whatever. Knowing, okay, like my wages are actually going to be not like insanely good, but
Mhm.
much better, by the end of next year or whatever. That is really good for somebody's mental health, right? Because low wages and economic insecurity is just not good for the level of uncertainty in your life. If you don't know if you're going to be able to pay rent next month or you have to choose between rent and food, or your student loan payments and food. Those are all mental health issues. So anyway, that's my rant on why I think all this stuff is very directly linked to mental health. So
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. We are in the midst of an unchecked pandemic. If that pandemic had been checked, as it was in Taiwan, as it was in New Zealand, and as it was even in the greatest population country in the world, China, it was stopped. And it was stopped because they used science and they tested everyone, millions upon millions, in China, billions of people, and tracked them and treated them. If you can get medical treatment, quality Medicare for all, a huge worry is gone. There's a book by Tyagi and Elizabeth Warren. Tyagi is the last name of Warren's daughter. And it talks about the 3 reasons that people go bankrupt. The number 1 reason is medical bills.
mm-hmm.
Then the second one is divorce, and the third one is unemployment. But medical bills are a huge shadow over people, and they're life-threatening. You have to go to a doctor, and if you can't, you die. These are mental health issues.
Right.
And when you were talking before, Max, I was thinking about how the Jared Kushner's complex in Maryland found a way, a loophole, so they can evict people during COVID. What does that mean for those evicted people's mental health?
Right.
As it is, child battery is associated with poverty and overcrowding.
Yep.
Because when there are so many strains on you, you're more likely to explode into violence than if you have fewer strains and you have money to get therapy. And a mental health benefit would be community mental health centers with therapy, family therapy, child therapy, adult therapy, couple therapy available to people, as well as groups to talk about and empower them in their struggles for end to evictions, reasonable rentals, and for a socialist program, which is actually a mental health program, of making the 5 basic needs, taking them out of capitalism, just like they take out armaments, and they stockpile them. Trump sold all our pandemic supplies to make money, but he doesn't sell all our guns. We have a stockpile that's bigger than that of all 6 next to most armed countries in the world. So if you have these priorities of clean air, which creates mental health because you can breathe and don't have asthma, of clean water because you're not always threatened with lead and other poisons from your water like they were in Flint, Michigan, of safe, affordable housing, shelter, of education that's quality education, not depending on how much money you have. And now, under the pandemic, at least 40% of kids aren't getting any education because their parents don't have the net, because they live in rural areas where it's not available, because nobody's there to help them with a glitch on their computer, and so on. That these things, plus safe, healthy food not laced with pesticides, should be taken off the capitalist marketplace. And that would contribute enormously to people's mental health because they wouldn't be getting sick and always threatened. They'd be safe. Safety is very important. A sense of being safe, a sense of having a home, a sense of being able to be settled. And those things are taken away in a rapacious capitalism like ours, and they can be changed and mitigated by a group struggle, which will have enormous psychological, benefits, not only because people will be safer, but also because they'll be connecting with each other with a hope of transforming their lives. Because two pillars of mental health are a sense of connection and belonging with other people
Mm-hmm.
and a sense of hope rather than
Mm-hmm.
despair. And so that organizing and accomplishing these needs has the mental health benefit of giving people connection and help. And that ties this all together, showing that it's not just in your head, even though what was done to you as a child is relevant, but it sure doesn't take up all the space of relevance. And that's what Max and I are trying to get across.
So there we are. That's why we are mental health professionals talking about these broad, holistic, systemic level issues in conjunction with the presidential election. I want to speak briefly on too. I think something that kind of saddens me, but it is just the way it is in our mass media kind of driven society. Is that I think I don't know if this is true for most voters, and although I do tend to think that most ordinary people are actually really smart, um,
Mm,
but
me
are treated
too.
like they're idiots. But because people are treated like idiots, the main focus tends to be sort of performativity and affect with political contenders, and it actually isn't so much on policy. Although I'd say that the socialist surge is very policy focused. It's
Mm,
saying like we're talking about the actual issues and specifics of how we want to implement different policies. But I think uh, one thing that I'll just continue to be sad about, I think, as time goes on, is that I think a lot of people voted for Biden because of the performativity and affect problems they had with Trump, meaning he would say a terrible thing, he would tweet a terrible thing, the way he said the thing sounded kind of racist or sexist, whatever, and it just sort of like stirred up something. It felt not right in terms of like virtue and morality and stuff in people, and so it was like, well, Biden's not as bad as that guy or whatever. So I just wanted to get that out of my system to say, um, I'm hoping if you're a listener if you're a little bit more maybe passively political, or you don't check out the policies or whatever, do try to look into that stuff a little bit more, because um, Biden not being Trump doesn't make him good
no.
inherently, and a candidate who, I mean, even the way that Bernie was, if you're like a Bernie fan, the way Bernie was constructing language was not going to guarantee that he'd be able to build a broad-based coalition to actually get the policies that he was calling for either, right? Even though he
Mm,
seems, for a lot of leftists, seems like a great person. Same with AOC, right? So I don't think we should expect everyone to sit around and have reading groups on like the actual nuts and bolts, like the finances of the policies, like, well, how would Medicare for all work or whatever. But we all need to look into those things a little bit more so we can have like a competent discussion about like, what are the actual policies we want? Like, what's the point of having a politician in a seat of power to be able to pass a law or whatever, or not pass a law? Like, what are the actual laws and policies we want? So based on that, maybe another segue, if you're okay with this, Harriet, is the going into the specifics of mental health based off of what Biden has said, because I think we could probably take a brief stab at this.
mhm.
If we think that these policies are good or not good, or if we actually believe that he'll be able to make movement in these areas. So from a website called mentalhealthforus.net, I don't know a whole lot about them. They're probably just some nonprofit organization doing mental health advocacy. Um, their first question is about suicide for him. They're saying suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the US, second leading cause of death for American youth. Every day, 20 veterans die by suicide. What steps would you take to prevent it? And so they have this. There's a series of questions. It's almost 20. It's like, I don't know. It's 12 questions. They're kind of long, so I'm not going to read every one. But with this one, Biden answered the question saying that he is going to, so in particular for veteran suicide, within the first 200 days in office, he's going to publish a comprehensive public health and cross-sector approach to address suicide in veterans, service members, and families. He's going to work aggressively to facilitate immediate access to mental health services for veterans, eliminate wait times, and there's a few other there's another thing that says like disseminate high quality treatments for PTSD. Just my immediate thing is to say, So I think on the campaign trail, especially these days, people are talking about things like veterans, suicides, mental health, and PTSD a lot more because it's a really massive issue. But I tend to feel a little bit skeptical when I hear politicians talk about it. And the reason for that is there doesn't seem to be a contextual discussion about why veterans, why PTSD, and why suicide. And to me, that means it's because they're not talking about the military industrial complex. They're not talking about war. They're not talking about the culture of the military, which is really brutal. And that, the U.S. military is kind of like the most socialist, one of the most socialist programs in the U.S. in that if you do enlist and you do a certain amount of time, you basically have, you have health care for life. You have access to all kinds of public services. And people critique like the vet centers and the quality of the, I forgot what they're called. Getting
The
a
VA
brain,
hospitals.
the VA hospitals. That's right. Yeah. The VA. And my uncle's a vet, and like, he's, he says it depends. Like, there's some that are really great. There's some that aren't great. But like, why would vets have such high PTSD? Why would suicide be so high? Like, I would actually rather have that conversation about mental health, because if you start from the perspective of like, well, if you ignore the fact that we still have like however many military bases around the world, and that we're still
Over
either
100.
directly over 100, and we're either directly or indirectly involved in some kind of occupation or like hybrid war, or like we're funding one side, and so, some of it's super covert. You only hear about it 20 years later. To me, that's a big part of the puzzle, if not the cause for why.
Right.
For why. So, I guess I think it's a good, sure, let's get more help for vets, but let's also stop sending people off to wars. Let's stop. I think like defunding the military would actually be an important part of this policy, but it's nowhere on the website.
That's true. It should be not totally defunding, but we don't have to have 7 times more armaments than everyone else while we've lost or come to a draw on every single war after World War II, because we didn't win
Right.
Vietnam, we didn't win Korea, and we haven't won anything else except on the tiny island of Grenada we won, but it's smaller than Rhode Island, so what are we talking about? However, there's another thing we could look at when we look at PTSD and the VA, and of course veterans should get help. They shouldn't be put in a position of fighting an unjust war against the united people of that society and slaughtering them. But also, one of the reasons that they go mad and commit suicide when they get home is the one thing they got from the military is a sense of camaraderie and connection with the men and women with whom they fought every day. And then they go home to their families and they don't have anything like that solidarity and support.
Right.
Because families are abandoned and trying to deal with a world that this kid has been in that they don't understand at all. The outrageous loneliness of the United States is a huge mental health problem, because 1 in 4 Americans doesn't have anyone to talk to, even in the worst, most needful period of their lives. So how can we connect people around building an America they believe in, which should be a mental health program? Because political or social activism, even if it's just PTAs or blood drives, it's doing something you believe in with other people, is a basic pillar of mental stability. And that should be included in our field.
I think there's something else about military culture from not just my uncle. I had a couple of uncles, and my dad was briefly in the Marines, and just my understanding of it from not being in the military is that it's such a different culture than the non-military. Like, military families will often talk about like just kind of basically, if you're not in the military, if you're not a military family, like, you don't get it. Sometimes they almost self-segregate because they're like, these people don't understand us. And part of that to me is it has to do with discipline and hierarchy. So there are 2 major elements of it, where there's such a clear chain of command between like different commanders, lieutenants, like all the different ranks, and that it's expected that you are compliant. If somebody in the hierarchy above you tells you to do something, you typically you don't even question it. You just do
Right.
it. And whether or not that's right or wrong, not even to comment on that necessarily. That is just very much not what our culture is. I mean, in a workplace, it's a little bit like that. But at least you have some rights. Like, I don't know, you can go to the labor board or something like that, but there's no like labor board in the military. I'm pretty sure
No.
there's like the guy tells you to do it, you do it. And the level of discipline of like getting up at the crack of dawn, the way you have to make your bed, the way you have to tie your shoes and everything. So I think there's a certain, it's actually not too dissimilar to what I understand about prisons, to be honest, which is that once you get out, there's a certain, you feel so alienated from everybody because most people around you were not in the military. And all of a sudden, you're like very alone, and you might have your family, like maybe your family kind of gets it. But also the way that you're typically trained in boot camp, and I don't know what things are beyond boot camp, but that they do kind of psychologically break you down. I mean,
Yes.
they're like verbally and emotionally very abusive to you.
And
Sometimes
you
there's
have to,
actually full on physical abuse. It's like being jumped into a gang. And
and
so
you have
you
to be
say,
up all night, many nights,
right.
and run and so on.
Right. So there's a context, sometimes I think there's this sort of special status put on veterans where it's like, oh, we need to help the veterans. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. But we need to actually question why vets in particular have it so bad. And that's
Right.
because of the way the military is set up. And we don't need to have a military as big as it is. We need to probably shrink it down.
We need
So,
to shrink it down, but also the military is as big as it is, and as many people sign up because it's about the only job an awful lot of people can get. And then a third of them get PTSD because
right.
they're invading people who don't want them. They're
Mhm.
shooting civilians in a way that's terrifying.
Right.
They're risking their lives for nothing,
Mhm.
and it's
Mhm.
terrifying. And
Right.
yet they have the solidarity of living with other people all the time
Mhm.
and having a camaraderie, which they desperately need and which is missing at home.
Right. Well, so that's just the first of 11 questions. I'm just going to look at the next two, and we can kind of get into those. But the second question they have for Biden is: every hour, 8 people in America die of drug overdose from opioids, and increasingly from other drugs as well. What would your administration do to turn the tide? And there's some good kind of fancy words: increased funding for stuff, and but then one of the things there says hold accountable big pharmaceutical companies, executives, and others responsible for their role in triggering the opioid crisis. I don't personally believe that, like almost at all. I don't see Biden doing that. Like as
No,
president, I don't think he'd sign an executive order. I don't think he'd build a big Democratic coalition. I mean, so many corporate Democrats are funded very, very heavily by big pharma. So I don't, or they're influenced by the hospital lobby, which is just the healthcare lobby generally is hugely funded by big pharma. So I don't see that as realistic personally. It would be good to allocate more public funding to programs for opioid use, but I think another key piece here is like, why have those addictions gone up so much? And obviously there's like you've mentioned, Harriet, the direct to consumer ads is an enormous problem. um there's no mention of that. Like why are people even told that there's certain drugs available to them, and then all of a sudden they think they should go ask their doctor for the drugs? That's an enormous problem. So that's sort of like a media reform issue. um then and one other thing I'll say is just like attachment trauma, that I think you need to have some void inside of you to want to seek uh hard drugs to self-medicate. And part of that, I think, is because of the decline of the American economy, the American family, and the ability for parents to actually raise their kids and build healthy attachment. Like this is sort of decades ongoing crisis, um, and you need a lot more socialism in place to actually address that. You need universal healthcare and housing and childcare to address those things, and Biden's not talking about those. So uh,
no. He's also not talking about the unified assault on people's bodies presented
mhm,
by the unity of the hospitals, which bankrupt
mhm,
people, the
Right.
doctors with their inflated fees and their regulation of how many people can go to medical school so they won't
Mm-hmm.
have competition on their prices, the
Mm-hmm.
insurance companies that bilk people and want to give them as little as they can for their money and leave them with big bills, and the
Yeah.
pharmaceutical who put out drugs in order to make money, and the drugs often kill people. But just as in the case of Zyprexa, in which the drug companies like Johnson and Johnson had to pay almost $1 billion, one of their representatives, when asked, laughed and he said, "Hey, when you're racing towards 17 billion, which is what they made through the misuse of that drug, you pay the traffic ticket."
Mm-hmm.
So they can get sued for some millions of dollars or even $1 billion, but if they're making 17 billion, that's the object, not helping
Mm-hmm.
people, making money. And so we'd have to take those things on which people's lives depend outside of the marketplace. So you'd have to end market based healthcare and have
Mm.
that be a basic need provided by Medicare for all or public health care, as it is in every other developed country. We're
Mm.
very backward that way. And that would be a mental health care problem because you'd get
Yeah.
mental health care there, but you'd also get relief from being bilked when you're the most vulnerable because you're ill.
Yeah. So these are, I think, the main takeaway for this for listeners, I guess, is these are really multifaceted issues. And
Mm.
again, neither of us are like anti-Biden. It's just good to think critically, like where, yeah, we should have some relief and some hope for those of us that are like anti-Trump and we're happy that Trump's going to be gone, assuming
Yes.
some insane coup doesn't happen or something. But even the stuff that he has written down here and on his website, they don't, well, they don't give me personally a lot of hope in that I don't think he'll be able to, with one pen stroke,
Mhm.
actually do any of the things he's talking about. It looks like really well packaged language that was probably fed to him by the DNC through focus groups and crap that they did, and it sounds really good. I don't think that he'll really do much or any of these things, and I just think the context is too broad, and just the concept of mental health being viewed as like a singular issue is kind of an
Mhm.
issue
That's
because
true
it
because
shouldn't be.
these issues, as you're saying, Max, are intertwined and they need to be addressed by a
Hmm.
totalistic environment, which is that we have
Hmm.
to end market forces
Hmm.
on the basic needs of human beings for care,
Yeah.
for shelter, for healthy food, for clean water,
Hmm.
and all of those things, for child
Yep.
care. And that those are an anti-capitalist program, and that has nothing to do with Biden. That has to come from a socialist party initiative.
That's right. Uh, do we? It's probably a good time to close. I mean, do you have any final thoughts on the whole Biden Trump president 2020 election?
Well, my final thought is it shows us we have a chance and we can regain a lot of mental health by joining together, connecting with hope, and changing this.
Yeah.
Changing
Uh,
market-driven healthcare of every and life care on every level.
that's right. And in vein of that comment we're making on how the bottom has to kind of push up and make Biden do stuff, and also make your city council do stuff, make your county board of supervisors do stuff, your state government do stuff, senators, congresspeople, make your boss do stuff. Unionize
Yeah.
your workplace, make your landlord do stuff, join a tenants union. There are a lot of ways to get connected, probably
Mm,
wherever you are. Even if you're in some rural area in the middle of nowhere,
that's
there's
right.
groups out there. There's people to connect to. And as the theme with our show is, try to get connected and um, stay active as much as you can.
And there's hope in that, in doing that together. There's hope and connection.
Hmm.
So we'll
Hmm.
all be happier people, more
Yeah.
mentally healthy.
And if you want, and so if you want some top secret, can't find it anywhere else, Harriet Fraud doing German impressions to sound like Dr. Sigmund Freud, become a patron. There's our marketing pitch.
Right.
Go to patreon.com/it's not just in your head. Become a patron. You can do like the cheaper like $3 a month one that you get like, I forgot even what we have on there. And then there's like 6 and it goes up different tiers. It really does help us to kind of subsidize it because it does take some work to do the podcast. So there's our pitch for that.
And it takes money too. And so we welcome you, whether you could pay or not, we welcome your listening.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can help us, then we'll give you extra hugs and prizes.
Yeah, absolutely. We also, I mean, we're not like, because we're not into like give us money in order for us to like care about what you have to say. We read every single email you send us. We try to respond to every single one. And sometimes we like to, if we think there's a really interesting question, we try to read it on air. If you are a patron and you have a question, we like definitely will read it on air and we'll discuss it. And also we're really open to guests. Like you don't have to be some extremely fancy, important, quote unquote, important person. Like we'll, everyday people we're cool with, as long as you're like good speaker, you have good ideas. So feel free to contact us. Any thoughts, questions, comments, criticisms at it's not just in your head @gmail.com.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.